Views, interpretations, and opinions expressed are not advice nor official positions presented on behalf of any organization or institution. They are for informational and entertainment purposes only. Welcome back. Today we dive deeper into the concept of weaponized religion, its initiation and propagation, and some characteristics that make us susceptible to the manipulation of narrative. Now join Ryan and Peter for another episode of the Tracking Wisdom podcast. So as far as weaponized religion goes, I think you said we were a little divergent on what our concepts were.
Yeah.
So tell me again about what you were thinking when you mentioned it.
So I had two thoughts in my head. One is thinking like the Crusades or whatever of church-sanctioned use of the faith structure. And then the second is people who tend to, well, like, you know, the Bible thumper kind of thing. The person who is passionate about their belief and has been taught that this is the right way, and it is out of their desire to spread the message and to save people from their ignorance that they go out and they use inflammatory language that is very aggressive, sure, or, you know, like, and that's where we were talking about, like, the homosexuality thing, like, it is a sin and it is in the Bible and God this, and very factual presentation of the information. That's kind of what I was thinking of with weaponized religion.
All right, so but in that case you're talking about someone who is, I guess, honestly trying to proselytize. Mm-hmm. So they're saying, you know, you need to know this because it's good for you.
Right.
I want to save your soul.
Yes.
Kind of thing. Okay. All right. And so I was thinking, I guess, more along the lines of the Crusades, which were, I mean, basically it's a mundane power grab. Mm-hmm. Based on supposedly theological rationale, right? That's right. And so that's really what I'm thinking about as weaponized religion. And I gave the examples, and I'm talking about the really pernicious, like literally killer religions,
right?
Or maybe, you know, at least violent, as opposed to just the really annoying verbal proselytizer. Mm-hmm. But I guess there's also there's the middle ground of, I guess I'm not really just focusing on the lethal weaponization, but hateful.
Yeah.
That's really what we're talking about. Hateful religion. And, you know, where does it come from? Why does it perpetuate? And I think it comes from, you know, the really cynical, abusive practice or position of a bad leader who says, I can manipulate this faith to give myself power, to address my personal agenda, to attack these enemies or change these institutions that I don't like. Mm-hmm. And it's manipulation of fear that's intentional, right? I mean, is it purely mundane interest? I suppose there's a possibility of some genuine spiritual concern. Mm-hmm. Right? That all the world's going to hell, things are, you know, people are not following the faith. We need a really radical approach to get the world back on track. Mm-hmm. So I suppose there can be an honest, spiritual, if vastly misguided, motivation to do it, as far as motivation goes, but the actual practice is manipulation of fear and perversion of the teachings, right, to say, oh, this means that you should go kill someone. So the whole idea of jihad as being, you know, the holy war against the infidels. Now, my understanding of Islam is meager, but my understanding is that jihad refers not to external conflict, but to internal conflict and struggle with your inner demons. Your jihad is your struggle with having your drives and wanting to be a good person, wanting to follow the teachings, but failing. And so you have to go back again. And, you know, you have these ideals that, yes, I believe in these things and that's the way I want to behave, but I don't because I yell at my kids.
Right.
And so I have to work against myself, and struggle to follow my ideals.
Mm-hmm.
And that's jihad. That's the struggle.
Interesting.
But of course, as we know it in the media from terrorism, jihad has been portrayed as the war against the non-Islam unbelievers,
right.
non-Muslim unbelievers, which is a horrible interpretation of it.
Right.
And incredibly inappropriate given that original meaning. So that's, from a leader's willingness to pervert a teaching to their own agenda,
yeah.
And then propagation or follow, like why would people buy into these things, right? And it's basically, it's easier to scapegoat. It's easier to blame someone who is other than to engage in the actual work of figuring out why do you feel so bad,
right?
And take responsibility for your feelings, which is again a core issue that we're talking about, which is you have a responsibility for your suffering.
Right.
It's your work to do, no matter what circumstance you are in. No matter how bad your circumstance is, you can work to reduce the suffering that you experience from that circumstance. And it doesn't mean the circumstance is your fault, and it doesn't mean that you should be Pollyanna. You should always be happy and smiling, even if you're, have this horrible disease, whatever. But you do have a role, and you can do work to manage and to mitigate the way you experience your circumstances. But unfortunately, and clearly we've seen many, many times and continue to see people who are willing to act out on the fact that it's easier, intellectually certainly, if nothing else, to blame someone else. And obviously it's spiritually easier to believe someone who tells you it's someone else's fault than to say that you have some work to do.
Right. In these other interactions.
Right.
It's the same behavior.
The issue is the willingness to be intellectually and emotionally lazy, and to take action on that. Willingness to be hateful, which causes everything from, suicide bombing to hate crimes and, blaming people for COVID.
I think that those behaviors have existed within the religious sphere for probably quite some time, and has, at least from what I can tell experientially, seemed to rear itself at least more so in recent decade, maybe in more cultural interactions. Certainly social media has been an impact just by virtue of the way the form and infrastructure works, I think, because it's impersonal. The comment about, it's easier lends itself to what I was trying to say earlier, I think, which is that yes, it's easier, and I guess I was trying to present it in a more rationalized way, meaning I understand why it's logistically challenging to try and do that work, and that we're presented in our culture currently. We have so much connection, but at the same time, so much impersonability in
anonymity.
Yeah, that it's there's so many things to look into. It's not like it used to be where you're getting information and insight from a smaller group on a smaller amount of things so that you could invest more of your time kind of delving into specific things. And now it's like everything's out there and everything needs to be investigated, but I have no time and energy to be able to invest that. Like, what do I focus on, I guess, so I can see how that's a challenge for people. It's always easier to point a finger than to look inside, and that's just part of the human condition, I think. And humans so it goes potentially back to fear. I guess that's what I would say, is that we all have the ability to be good or bad if you were to put value statements on them. And it is through fear that we engage with the things that would be considered bad or hateful or hurtful. And so I guess I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but like I think there's more to discuss, and we don't have to do it at this moment, but more to discuss around the why. The why, not from the leadership perspective, because I think that's fairly clear. But why is it that we, as the general population, are so inclined to relinquish our own personal thought for somebody else?
Well, so I think that people who do it don't think it's for someone else. So there's two things. So, I mean, for someone else in terms of being manipulated, right? But also, and it has to do with emotionality. Like, I'm really angry and this makes me feel better to vent my anger kind of thing, rather than working through your role in your anger and understanding what the conflict is and trying to resolve a conflict, saying my anger is because someone is doing this to me.
Right.
Yeah, so I would say it's that self-interest that doesn't want to do the either introspection or just plain research. And you're mentioning social media and kind of bumper sticker communication of no in-depth communication happening, and people just yelling at each other in little bits and bytes, so that there's no actual communion of interaction. Yeah, and no learning. And no learning from each other. So, again, contrary to what we want to do is we want to take the time to say, why do I disagree with you? Why do you disagree with me? What are you not understanding about what I'm saying? Or what are you just disagreeing with? Oh, you believe this and I don't believe that. Oh, okay.
And we can agree to disagree.
Yeah. I mean, but there's no interest in doing that because there's a personal agenda to, I just need to feel better right now.
Right.
Or I just want to hear something that affirms my belief.
Yeah.
Even if it's a angry echo chamber, it's like, well, that just shows I'm right.
Right.
And we want to be right.
Right.
So, rather than, well, I don't want to just believe I'm right. I want to know, what's right, and I want to do what's right. Yeah. But some people, the lazy approach is, no, I just want to be right. And so I'm going to look for someone who agrees with me, and then I'll do whatever they say because they're letting me be right.
And as soon as we are emotionally triggered, it's very hard for us to then stop and say, I want to think about this intellectually. So I think that maybe some of what we see is that because you are so emotionally charged, and that's the intent, that it's presented in a way intentionally so as to emotionally drive you and not intellectually drive you. And then it's incumbent upon us, the listener, to say, I need to think about this intellectually before I react on it.
Right. So, and I think there are two components to that. And one is just the physiology of it, knowing that the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems exist in opposition, and that if you are emotionally triggered, your rational function is actually suppressed.
Right.
And people not knowing that. And so they're susceptible to being triggered and then thinking that their decision process when they're triggered is perfectly valid when it's not. And then the other thing is an intentional preference for the emotional over the intellectual, which is to say, I don't think it's an active choice and that's people's fault, but I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with an intellectual process. They are just... for whatever variety of reasons, they value the emotional over the intellectual. The personality typing MBTI approach, which I think is used as an excuse. I mean, for people who subscribe to MBTI, some people who score F on MBTI use it as an excuse to say, well, feeling's more important to me, so I don't need to engage in the thinking process.
Sure.
When really all it does is identifies a tendency in you and identifies what you're comfortable with. It doesn't identify what you're capable of doing. Or exactly. And so that's what I was thinking of, the people who choose. And that's I think where it's a valid use of the word of people choosing emotionality because they chose to understand it that way, that it was affirming their right to be emotional and not to be intellectually responsible
right.
For how they behave.
There's extreme on both fronts, and the way is probably something in the middle.
Well, so actually, I wanted to kind of address that because I keep on using the word intellectual, and I realized that word can really put some people off.
Sure.
And that it can sound elitist. And, I don't want to say that you and I are intellectuals and we're better than other people. It's just that's the way we process the world. And we want to share with our listeners this way of doing things, and it's not the only way of doing things. And it doesn't mean that if you don't process things this way, we don't want to hear from you,
right.
Or we minimize the value of what you have to say. We want to understand your perspective. This is our perspective. So it's only an issue when this is my perspective, it's the only valid perspective.
Right.
I'm emotional. That's the only thing that matters.
Right.
Like you're rationalizing things and thinking things through, and being all intellectual doesn't have value. And that's where the danger is. Likewise, if I say, well, you haven't thought this out, so your teachings don't have value to me because they're not intellectual. No, it's very important for me to learn what you have to say from your different way of processing the world, adding that to the way I process and my experience.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Tracking Wisdom podcast. Join us next time as we continue the discussion. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and visit www.eth-studio.com for more information and content.